Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night to all who are listening to us at this point, and wherever you are in the world. Thank you and welcome to this special roundtable. Peace Research in the Age of Global Rupture, Challenges and Opportunity. This is an event co-hosted by the ISA Peace Studies Section and the Brazilian Peace, Conflict and Political Security Network. I'm Camila Braga from the Universidad Católica del Peru, also representing here our growing research community in Brazil, who is coming to their 10th anniversary. So we are also welcoming in this October to Brazil. And with me, it's an honor to co-host this event with Professor Sun-Yun Lee from the University of Soka, representing here the ISA Peace Studies section. As chairs, we are so glad to see this turnout, particularly for this event that we call as Age of Global Rupture, a time where, well, we know it's critical to all of us, and all of us will see this as critical in a certain way. But it's a time where the very foundations, the very normative frameworks we have worked and we have developed around our different studies areas, it is seen under siege. And today we are here not just looking for how to criticize, how to provide critics about this kind of development, but also we are looking for resilience and a way of reimagine our field. And for this, we have the perfect group. We are joined here by the 2026 Peace Studies Section Distinguished Scholar Thania Paffenholz from the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies. Thania, first, congratulations for the award. We know it's very well deserved because it has inspired a lot of us, and particularly I would say for the Brazilian community. We have learned a lot with you over the years. Thank you so much. And to say a few words, I would like to welcome Professor Lee to announce our distinguished scholar.
Yeah, thank you so much, Camila. And it's a great pleasure to meet you all today. I basically want to reiterate what Camila just has mentioned. As many of you must be aware, the Peace Studies section of the International Studies Association presents the Distinguished Scholar Award to an individual whose lifelong dedication has fundamentally influenced how we understand and practice peace. And this year, it's a pleasure to announce that Thania Paffenholz as our 2026 recipient. And the review committee highlighted that Thania's work has been instrumental in bridging the gap between high-level theory and the everyday reality of peace building. So it is a pleasure to be here to celebrate it together with you. Although we can't hear you, the audience, due to the format of the event, please join me congratulating Thania on this achievement. Well done. Many congratulations. And this particular roundtable has been organized in conjunction with the award to envision the ways we, the people in peace and conflict community, to navigate the ongoing and emerging challenges in our time. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And finally, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Brazilian Research Network on Peace, Conflict, and Critical Security Studies for co-hosting this event, and ISA's Office of Professional Development for taking care of all the difficult logistical issues so far. So that's all from me, Camila. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sian. And building on Thania's scholarship, we are joined today by a group of leading thinkers who will navigate with us this fractured landscape. I would like to briefly introduce. Also, we have a few turnout at the last minute. I'm so sorry to say that Professor Cedric Koenig could not join us. He will try to join us later, and we are hoping he's able. Also, Professor McGinty couldn't make it, but we have a really amazing panel with us today. first with Professor Ezra Calheira from Bilken University, Marie-Joëlle Sahar from the University of Montreal, Roberto Belloni from the University of Bologna, and Christine Chang from King's College London. Here we have a fast-paced dialogue. It's built for maximum dialogue, so we'll start with a 10-minute talk from Professor Thania. Then we are followed for 40 minutes roundtable discussions where our speakers will have around 6 to 8 minutes to develop their points and addressing Thania's talk and for any inquiry. And then we will return to Thania for her response. And then it's up to our public to present their questions. So for this, I will ask you to use the Q&A chat box that you have on your screen. Please make use of it because we are going to be curating some of the main questions to address here, and the others, of course, we will try to send them to their right individual speaker. So please, when presenting your questions, present yourself, where you come from, and to whom you are directing the question. Well, without further, I would like Thania to have the floor. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Camilla, and thank you so much, Sejong, and also to ISA for really organizing this, because we all felt like this year's ISA, not everybody could make it, so really have a discussion, and then I think also bring the colleagues in, and I'm very happy to have the team here to have this discussion. And when Sung-Yong asked me what the topic is, I gave two topics, but everybody said it's about this. It's about really what we do with peace research in this age of global rupture. And I think that's a very fair question. And so I will just give you some of the ideas I have, because for me, really the question is, do we need to rethink peace research? Is that what we do, or is it something else? And in order to come closer to an answer would be maybe said too much, but closer to the topic, I would like to highlight 3 points. So where did we come from as a peace research community? Where are we now? And what is the responsibility of peace scholars to move us forward? Those who know me, I really like to talk about the responsibility. I borrow that from Hannah Arendt, because she said in times of crisis, there is a responsibility of the intellectuals. And I see this as a mega time of crisis. So we have a responsibility. We cannot just hide. But how would that look like? And what does it mean for each of us? Because not all of us do the same things. So where did we come from? So I really like to highlight always that peace research did not emerge as something neutral science. It was really, as we know, founded by the founding mothers and fathers of peace research to really affect change, to counteract at the time of the Cold War, the existential threat of nuclear war, but also systemic violence. And if you look back in Kenneth Boulding, Elise Boulding, Galtung's early writings, all this is highlighting. And I think that is very important to know, because there would have been no need to have peace research, because it could be embedded under international relations without any problems. You don't need peace research if it's not different. And I think what I see what happened over those decades is that we've become pretty good IR scholars, actually, with a focus on peace. On the one hand, that's not bad, because we have to produce, we have to write in journals, we have to have ranking, we have to have publications, we have to have discipline, because if you establish yourself as discipline, you have to do this. But maybe that's a bit of a critical view, but I feel it has become self-referential. Very often, when I talk to some PhD students and I try to sort of say, okay, we can go to this place and we can advise this peace process and I'm going to take you. And people said to me, well, no, I have to write this journal article. That's more important. And I'm like, okay, they are kind of both important, but what's the balance? So I think I'm a bit scared about that development, that we have become like self-referential. So this is where I see where we came from. Where are we now? Now, the main thing is we are at war. I think that's the crucial fact where we are in. And I think that's very different from the times when our discipline was founded. We were at a Cold War. Now we are at a series of global hot wars. So even more, the original intention is really needed. Where we are at as well is, and we know that, is everybody talks now the liberal peace is over. Short-term peace deal making is also not the alternative. But I think what I see is that our community is like torn between, we have criticized, especially many among us critical peace scholars, we have criticized the liberal peace big time. Yeah. But now we are saying, oh, but the normative things that were so relevant, they are all gone. So what we do? So there is like, we don't really sort of settle this tension that between the two. We know that the liberal peace as it was implemented, we didn't like it. We also know the short-term deal making, we also don't like it. But what do we like? What's our vision? Where do we work towards? I don't see that. So, and I think we have been really, really good in analyzing the world as it is. And there were really good studies and articles coming out recently, good discussions everywhere about the status of the world. But we have been less consistent in really asking whether our work is changing anything that matters. That's a bit brutal, I know. And I was rereading that famous phrase of Einstein, who said, "Not everything that can be counted counts." And I think when I listened to some of the panels at ISA in March, I was thinking, yeah, it's kind of true. So what does it mean to be a responsible peace scholar, or whatever you want to call yourself? Peace and conflict resolution doesn't mean, we all mean the same thing. It's really challenging because it's not that easy, because you have to also like do some research backwards in order to understand the future. So, but the challenge for me is not simply to say, okay, we need completely different research. For me, it's more like, how do we adapt and reframe and rethink what we do and how we see and analyze reality at the same time with the reality that is happening now and in the future, and not just like the backwards, because I feel we're not historians, we are peace researchers. So yes, I think the fundamental thing that drives us is to understand peace and its conditions. So that means, and some of you know, I have developed this concept of perpetual peace building, which basically says it's an ongoing thing, and it's the constant renegotiation of the social and political contract. And what we see now is that I developed that concept in mind of a particular country that goes through this and has critical junctures where this renegotiation happens through peace talks, dialogues, constitutional reforms, whatever. But in fact, where we are at now is we see the need for we see a global, it's not the need, we see the reality, it's a global renegotiation. What is the social and political contract of this world? So what does this mean? And how can we contribute to this? So I think what I see is the way research is funded and designed is not doing the job, because it's like linear. Okay, you fund the research, you only assess it in terms of research excellency. You don't even assess it in terms of relevant for anything to be changed. After you have the research, you give it to some other department and say disseminate and then change the world. It's not working like this. And the few of us like on this panel, particularly also, who are also working with practice and policy, we know that's not the way it works. It also, don't get me wrong, doesn't mean that I say everybody who's in research has to be close to policy. No, that's not needed, because it's important that we produce important research that those of us who do the translation can also use. But we can't use things that don't matter. So I think How do we know what matters today and in the future? What kind of discussions do we need in order to better understand our research subject? And also, I really feel like we have to radically interrogate the systems we are working in, both in academia and in practice, and be collectively in this, because it doesn't help if one of us or two of us write something critical. If we want to influence the design and funding of peace research, and also how it can influence and the conversations we like, then we need to understand the systems. We need to have a broader collective strategy. And I really think that is what is needed. We need spaces where we, on the one hand, kind of talk like we do now, but then we need to put it to the next level of how do we translate that into action. So in sum, I would like to give the others a chance to talk as well. Do we need to rethink peace research in an age of global rupture? My answer is yes and no. No, because I think we simply need to remind us where we came from, what was the origin of why we are peace researchers. The other thing is no, because we still need to analyze and develop also new frameworks to understand the complexity. Yes, we need to change, because I think we need to be more change-oriented and really radically question the what and the how we contribute, and what we research and how we research, in order to contribute to this global renegotiation, so that we really can create these spaces where we discuss how do we affect change with the research we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thania, for raising such strong points. And we have powerful reflections to make now. I will just pass the floor to Professor Ezra Grader to run her reaction. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much. And I'm very happy to be on this panel too with my colleagues and also with Thania. And she already said some of the things that I wanted to say. No wonder we've been working together for many years. But it's really an honor, and I'm very happy, and congratulations, Thania, again. And thank you so much to ISA for organizing this online webinar. So my take on the question is not very different. I also went, trying to answer these two questions, I also went back in the history of peace research a little bit, and try to see how it developed and whether it can be useful for today. But I would like to make basically three main points. One of them is that this normative question that we had, or it's not a hypothetical question anymore, but it is an empirical question now, right? What is happening? So we've been discussing this. We all have a hunch, and we, in all these meetings that I've been in the last 2-3 years, this has been the hot topic, etc. We all have a hunch, but actually we are now observing it. And it's an empirical reality. We can observe it. So basically, this leads me to ask this question: that what is it that we observe, right? What is happening? And I am not sure that all of our observations are sound and unbiased, because some of our observations about what is going on today, there is a gap between our perceptions and maybe feelings also, in addition to perceptions, and what is going on, what is happening empirically. So a lot of us, for example, wrote about this new environment as, the decline of multilateral peacemaking is one thing that pretty much people agree on. Focus on short-term deal-making, transactional mediation, or short-term ceasefire mediation taking over long-term transformative processes is another thing that a lot of people wrote about. Focus of mediation or peace processes on ceasefires and humanitarian issues. Fragmentation of mediation is another thing that a lot of people wrote about, right? So we've been writing and talking about these things, and especially the term or the word that has kind of replaced the liberal peace building is transactionalism, right? But then, is this really the dominant game in town, really, right? I would like to point out to this terrific article that just recently published about a month ago, I think, by Allard Duursma, where he systematically compared basically the type of mediation that was happening, decades ago and today. And basically, one thing that he says is that, using this Peace Observatory data, he says that many core mediation practices have remained strikingly stable across periods, okay? The average number of mediators is unchanged. UN involvement still is the case, even though it's not in the lead in most of these cases. Coercive mediation existed before too, still exists, so it hasn't really increased in number. And ceasefires pretty much occur at similar rates. So what has changed then? Okay, basically what he says is that, there are these three ideal type mediation logics, right? This is what he calls it. Liberal norm-based, which highlights or prioritizes the process, inclusivity, legitimacy, etc., liberal norms. But this always coexisted with the coercive, or what, we all know what happened in Yugoslavia and how that war ended, for example, right? So that always existed. And he also says that this transactional logic also existed in mediation before, right? The carrots, incentives, side payments, deal making. In fact, I mean, all these negotiation books that were written decades ago talk about these concepts and how they play a role in negotiations, right? So basically what he says is that what has changed is basically that this, maybe it's the framing of things rather than the practice, the framing, the rhetoric, and what some major powers talk about mediation or peace. So our talk about peace has changed. Really, our framing of peace has changed, rather than how this is done in practice, the nitty-gritty. So that's, I think, an important thing to think about, right? Why, even though we had deal-making or transactional negotiations 20 years ago too, during the Cold War as well, so why do we think that this is almost a new thing today, right? So I think we need to think about some of our biases as well, in terms of what has changed. Is it our feelings? Is it because mediation field has become very professional, and that we see these professionals are to a large extent left out of the processes today? Is that because how we feel it, or is this more a Eurocentric definition of the problem? And Thania is right, actually. For decades we wrote about the critique of the liberal peace building paradigm. It's us who did it, right? I mean, 1990s, for almost 2 decades, we talked about the downside of liberal peace building. So for many, we talked about the consequences of this for the global South, the exclusion of global South, the local actors, so on and so forth. So we talked about this. So liberal peace building was not the ideal anyways, right? It was never the ideal. But then, to what extent, in that sense, I would like to highlight Thania's question. To what extent that criticism was actually absorbed and reflected in how peace processes were designed and implemented. The last point that I would like to make is, again, like going back to our field and how some of these normative approaches have shaped, emerged. our field's normative ground did not emerge in a liberal era, like what Thania said. And it emerged in the post-World War II Cold War period, in fact, another very dark period in terms of conflicts in the world. And if you look at the work of like Galtung's and like Elise Boulding, again, like Lou Kreisberg's, etc., the main focus was social change, right? And constructive conflicts. I am a student of Lou Kreisberg's, so that concept of constructive conflicts. How do we make conflicts more constructive? How do we move them away from a destructive to a constructive path? And a lot of this work was shaped, as I said, in the shadows of nuclear annihilation, decolonization wars, proxy conflicts in the Cold War, similar to today, etc. And yet, these people managed to pioneer some ideas to establish a subfield as peace research, right? And they observed what was happening, and most of them, their starting point, at least for Lou, like some people, it was the social movements, basically, the peace movements, the people's movements, etc. So I'm kind of, this is a gut feeling rather than an observation, but I feel like our field will remember some of those roots today as well. And we have focused too much on negotiations and mediations, what is happening in the rooms. But we kind of, design and technicalities, sort of workshops and this. But I think we will again move closer to these social movements or pro-peace movements, and we see the beginnings of that emerging around the world as a response to this backlash that we are seeing. So let me just wrap up saying that they managed to do it, as I said, in a very dark period of history, if the question is, are we going to be brave enough like them to look at what is happening, understand what is happening, rather than going into this nostalgia of what it used to be, and then coming up with innovative and new ideas to address the new challenges. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Esma, and for those insightful and very provocative reflections. We are all thinking about it. I would just pass the floor to Professor Marie-Joëlle Saab. You have the floor, please, Professor.
Thank you, Camilla. Thania, it's an absolute pleasure to be part of this, not just to celebrate you, which is important, but also to discuss what I think is becoming, and I think Ezra is right, a bit of a crisis of conscience within the field that could be paralyzing, and that's a danger. So I'm going to be echoing a number of the things that you've said, but I want to take this also in a slightly different direction. I think that, Thania, you were right in highlighting the role we've played in great part in creating this crisis. I'll frame it slightly differently. We've had a tendency to throw the baby with the bathwater. So today we're wondering whether peace research is gone because of the rupture, and there is a rupture internationally. We drove very stark contrasts between liberal and non-liberal peace, top-down, bottom-up, transaction, transformation, as Ezra mentioned. And in our attempt to highlight differences, we may have erased continuities, nuance, and complexity. And so in many ways, we might be partially responsible for where we are now. Now, having said that, and I see that there are at least two of the colleagues who were with us in Aberdeen this summer, Geroyd Miller and Rebecca Abiola online. There are things we know, and we discussed these issues actually back in early July in a meeting that Groyd had organized. And we were reminded in the discussion that there are things we know, but we don't defend our knowledge sufficiently. We know, for example, that even when you win a war militarily on the ground, you still need to talk. And so this idea of victory as opposed to dialogue, which is so current nowadays in certain policy circles, is something that we can push against. We know from your work, the work of Ezra and others, that inclusive peace is more sustainable than non-inclusive peace. And so we should be writing about, those processes where even some of the main parties are not present, right? So there are things we know that we don't defend or we don't actually put in the public space sufficiently. Part of the problem, I think, as you've highlighted, has to do with the structures and systems of academia and the way in which they create incentives and disincentives. But I think that this is also something that is not just a function of the funding, but will be a challenge in the current environment. So you talked, Thania, about the need for, changing the funding of research. But for research that is nuanced, that highlights complexity, that does not end in a cycle of funding that is 2 years, because something like perpetual peace building or adaptive peace building that has been put forward by others requires us to go back and again and to follow things and processes in the long term. That requires the kind of funding that goes against the grain, the current grain, where a lot of the money is not only being directed away from peace research towards defense and security, right? But also where the money is increasingly short-term and requires us to provide clear, and by clear I think I mean simplistic, ready-made solutions. So one of the things that are happening nowadays, particularly in the West, where security has become such an overwhelming obsession, is that this has consequences on the funding schemes that I think will actually deepen the problem. I do also think that there are things that we have either left out or tried to skirt in the discipline in general that we need to rethink. Part of the reason why we've been, as a peace research community, less effective is that we often don't even agree on what peace is. In striving for difference, right? The self-referential, I need to make an argument that is different from others. We've actually fragmented the notion of peace into subsets: feminist, just, sustainable. I mean, the adjectives are so varied. But as with colleagues, we noted this has resulted in echo chambers where we don't even talk to one another across the field. And that, I think, is something that needs to change. I also want to make points about how we ask questions and what questions we ask. Because Thania, you're absolutely right. There are constraints on academia and they make us approach our topics in certain ways. But there are also constraints on the systems that we study, whether they are states, organizations. Not everything is down to ill will or, to ideological positioning. Some of the most, I think, interesting and useful stuff I've read in recent years has been organizational analyses of how professionalization within the UN system leads people to discount, for example, local knowledge. And that raises different kinds of questions for us, because if we want peace, we also want to think about how to change incentives within systems. And that means that we don't study only thematic issues around peace, but also organizational issues that may look like they have nothing to do with peace, but in fact are fundamentally important. Likewise, I think that one of the things that are salutary about the present moment, in spite of all the darkness, is that it has forced us all to acknowledge the importance of emotions and to rethink the rational choice bases that many people in the field, not all of us, but many people in the field, took as their starting point. Today, when we look at the conflicts raging around the world, we cannot ignore the fact that there are questions we need to think about, not just interests, but feelings, memories, history, and what have you, which, even though they look like, they're focusing on the past, are essential to be able to consider the future. And then finally, Thania, you quoted Hannah Arendt. I want to quote Francisco Goya. Goya talked about the silence of reason. And as academics, we are supposed to be the beacon of reason. Not our own self-referential attitude, but also our own narrow and sometimes totally understandable calculus to avoid risk are actually contributing to our inability to be present in the public sphere at a moment where our voice matters. Many people around the world, and I know we face difficulties, but are actually self-censoring because of the way in which our governments have narrowed the public space. And I think part of the conversation, no matter how we position ourselves on the issue of whether or not there is a rupture, is how do we actually engage and re-broaden the public space for conversations that are needed, but are currently either frowned upon or actually completely limited by governments and narrow interests.
Thank you, Professor. And thank you so much for those insightful points. We all have a lot to think after this panel. I would just give the floor to Professor Roberto Belloni. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
Thank you. Well, let me start by thanking ISA for organizing this discussion. I'm really delighted to be part of this, and it also gives me an opportunity to see, at least online, all friends and the colleagues who I have not seen for a long time. So that's also very nice. I like to focus my few minutes on essentially two issues. Two main points that Thania and the colleagues who talked before me in some ways touched upon. And one is knowledge production within the academia and the role of knowledge production. And the other one is this idea of rupture, which is the heart of the conversation that we are having and the extent to which we are living within a really new system or transition into a new way of thinking about peace and war. With regard to the first point, to knowledge production, I like to start by, well, Thania, we are here, after all, to celebrate Thania's award. So I like to acknowledge publicly that I've learned a great deal from Thania. Thania mentioned in her talk the logic of academic production that pushes us to focus on publications, on disciplinary positions, and so on and so forth. And this logic very often involves also trying to find the flaws in an argument or in some kind of scholarly evidence or to discuss someone else's work. Marie-Joëlle was saying earlier that to make our own argument different from others, we need to criticize very strongly. That was implied in her speech in many ways. And that we don't, as a result of that, often we don't talk too much to each other. Let me say something slightly different. I'd like to express my gratitude to Thania, and because I've learned a great deal from her, in particular with regard to civil society, and I had the good fortune to be part of a large project that Thania, famous project that Thania coordinated and led on civil society and peace building. And I have to say that that project uh, helped me understand the importance of civil society, which to an extent I knew already, but also, very importantly, the methodological rigor required to study civil society. And Tanya may recall how many times we went back and forth to try to clarify concepts and ideas and methodology, etc., etc. And I must admit, I don't want to say that I hated it at that time, but certainly was very, very demanding for me. And I certainly learn a great deal. So this is to suggest that if we are that Tanya set a very demanding standard to measure my own work against, and so I want to thank her for this, and it's very formative for me and continues to be a source of inspiration. Strictly intertwined with this is the kind of knowledge that we generate, and Tanya suggested that our debates somehow seem to be anchored to a world that no longer exists. The world is changing and moving on very quickly. And she highlighted the gap between understanding the world and shaping it, and questioning whether the extent to which we could try to have an influence and impact on this world and so on. And I very much agree with this analysis. And what is most striking to me, at least, is that we have quite a broad knowledge about peacemaking, peace processes, international intervention, local realities, local needs, and so on. The speakers who preceded me talked about mediation that perhaps didn't change very much over time, the importance of dialogue in war, the importance of inclusive peace. The more you are inclusive, the more likely that peace agreements can be implemented successfully, etc., etc. So this is just to say that we know a lot about peace, and we, as a scholar, I think it's important to remember that as a scholarly community, we did. Sorry, I hope I'm not patting ourselves too much on the back, but we did a fairly good job in advancing the knowledge about peace processes, and we need to recognize that. Now, the other side of the coin, so to speak, is that we don't necessarily have a policy structure in place. We have a very complex peace architecture, which is not actually working as intended at the moment. And this is clearly visible to everyone. We are stuck. The liberal international order is not working despite the gigantic amount of knowledge that we have generated and accumulated. So why is that? And how do we move forward from that? I mean, I think it's fair to say that policymakers, talking about knowledge production and influencing the policy world, the policymakers do not always like what scholars suggest, because very often what scholars suggest require time to a long-term time frame and care for the local knowledge, etc., many more other things. And so steps forward in peacemaking do not always come from policymakers, from politicians, from state actors, who very frequently work within the existing state-centered system and oftentimes tend to be quite conservative. So moving away from war structures and violence and so on, and towards justice is something that political power tends to resist. So the question that perhaps we can ask is, how do we move beyond this impasse and the extent to which we can do that? Now, talking about knowledge production, my impression, and I'm happy to hear your viewpoints on this, is that academia has become very uncritical and quite conservative. There is the modus operandi in academia, as Thania suggested, is about publications and the journal ranking and all of that. And we train, or very often PhDs are trained in paying attention to these sort of issues and so on and so forth. And what is missing is a critical view of this, of the broader work that we are doing. And Mary-Joelle was mentioning funding schemes, and I know for experience with the European Union and others that there are certain constraints that set the boundaries that are set with regard to what you can do and what you can research and what you can focus on and so on and so forth. So perhaps this is my suggestion, to go more on the positive side of things. That is my suggestion, to remind ourselves that very often when we are stuck, as seems to be the case now, change historically seemed to come from those societies that experience war and disruption. And also knowledge emerges from very often social movements, from civil society, talking about, again, the project that Thania coordinated, from social agency. And we need to acknowledge more, perhaps, in our work, what perhaps can be defined as peripheral knowledge, not understood simply in geographical terms. So certainly the Global South has to be acknowledged, the work of the Global South and the social movement there, etc., etc. That's for sure. But there is much more going on everywhere in the world, of social movements, of environmentalists, people debating disarmament, etc., that we need to pay attention to and learn from in order to oppose, this is my closing point, what the former president of Doctors Without Border called the International Sacrificial Order. That is to say, the idea that political systems, including liberal ones, rely on the sacrifice of certain populations to achieve or maintain stability and security. So in other words, international sacrificial orders justify even death as necessary for the greater good. Now, it seems to me, talking about Rupture and peace studies and so on and so forth, that Gaza, what happened in Gaza in the last 3 years or so, is a very tragic example of how the international sacrificial order has, I don't want to say has won in some ways, but certainly has affirmed itself against other values of human rights, dignity, respect for human life, and so on and so forth. More and more, the international system seems to justify the death as necessary of civilians, of people who have nothing to do with war, in order for a greater good, which is security, stability, and stability in the Middle East, however you want to call it. So I think that there are movements opposing this. I was very touched personally by, for example, the flotilla trying to bring medicines, and et cetera, to make a political point, to oppose the international sacrificial system. And so the point I'd like to make to conclude is that this international sacrificial order may, I think, to my mind, unfortunately, has to an extent affirmed itself over the last decade or so. But change is possible, and perhaps there is a new knowledge that can be generated from the bottom up, from the peripheries intended, and by this I mean again, not simply global peripheries, but peripheries everywhere, in even my own town, but peripheries of thinking, not the official academia, not the official structures, and so on and so forth, we can draw from in order to resist this international sacrificial order that must be condemned. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Roberto. And just because we have few time, I would just say I agree. Thank you for your talk. I will pass the floor then to Professor Christina Cheng from King's College University.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to ISA and to Signon for organizing and to Camilla for chairing. Thania, I'm so pleased. And I think a lot of the comments that you opened up with come from your experience as somebody who sits on the edge of the practitioner world and your engagement with deep academic research. And it's sitting as one of the translators of those two worlds that makes you such a valuable person to our community. So thank you for being that. And thank you for the work that you've done. I want to talk about those things and the interface of those things in the way that you framed them. There's a lovely LinkedIn piece for those of you who haven't read it that Thania posted, and it is based on the speech that she gave at ISA. But the last chunk of it is talking about our responsibility as scholars, that which she talked about in her opening remarks. So I'm going to say just really two things that I think I really want you to remember as a group of, being part of the same community here, studying peace and conflict for a very, very long time. The first is that our space is closing. I think Marie-Joëlle illustrated that and talked about it quite beautifully. But I would go a step further and say it's becoming deeply political and politicized. And the consequence of that is, I think, that we have to actually think about our ethics differently than we used to, right? So this change in the political space and what we are and aren't allowed to say is going to affect the way in which we do our work. And we have to actually be so much more deeply conscious and aware of that. So that's the first thing. And I'll say more about that in a second. And then the other thing to say is actually something of hope and joy, and to think also about what Thania said at the beginning, which is we have done a lot of work collectively in this field to think about what peace and conflict looks like in lots of other places outside of our home states. I would say that it is time to take those tools and to apply them to our own societies and to think about the global north as the subject of study now. I felt that actually for quite a long time. I don't think that it's been as apparent as it has been until the past couple of years. But I would really say, very obviously to me, since the election of Donald Trump and Brexit back in 2016, that we should have been taking our peace building tools and applying them at home. So that's the second big thing that I'm hoping that we will all think about this space and what that means for all of us as scholars. So in the context just of the first comment about our space becoming more political and thinking about our ethics, I think part of that is that before we had the luxury of being in a place that was not fraught with polarization for most of us. And I think most of us in this conversation today are coming from the global north, right? That things were relatively peaceful at home. And so it felt okay. And the answer to, some of the questions that have been posed earlier, why we did the kind of research that we did, why we were so critical. You can be deeply critical when you feel like the framework itself actually needs to be rattled a bit to move the things around so that people can see what is going on, right? So I feel like many of us operating as critics, straight up critics, and others, maybe some of us were operating as critical friends. And I would put myself into the camp of critical friends. I don't think of myself as being a deeply radical scholar, but I do think of myself as being deeply critical of the things that the global north has been particularly hypocritical about. But the context has changed now. And so the question is, how do we what are we allowed to say? Does that mean that, being critical of our own countries makes us traitor to the existing framework, right? And I don't think that we need to fall into that trap, right? I don't think it's either or, but it is very difficult to communicate nuance in this day and age, but maybe all the more important that we do so. And criticism, I don't think should be a luxury, but sometimes it feels like it is, but we have to be just very, very careful about that feeling. So how do we study the things that matter to our reality? That I think is the transition to the second bit about thinking what we study at home, right? And I would say many of us now live in societies that are much more polarized than they were when we first started as scholars many, many years ago. That polarization has come about due to a whole vast variety of factors, including, terrorism and 9/11, including social media, now probably including fake news and AI, and so many, many factors. And we can't stop a lot of those. Those are structural changes that are not within our ability to influence. What we can do, though, is think more deeply about, and I can't remember who was talking about this now, but just about peace movements, Ezra, talking about peace movements, social movements, going back into the work of folks like Erica Chenoweth and Mary Stephan, and that sort of work, I think, needs to fuse together more closely with the peace and conflict field in a way that maybe it hasn't in the past. So I'm just thinking about what this looks like for us space, right? And that led me to a book that I actually first had the chance to read about 20 years ago when it was a draft. And it is a brilliant book. I can show it, well, probably it's going to be a bit blurry, but it's called Passion, Craft, and Method in Comparative Politics. It's edited by Gerald Monk and Richard Snyder. And it's basically about how scholars, really famous comparative politics scholars, went through their life and the experiences that they had and how they then responded as scholars and how that really influenced their research. And I just want to read you like a couple of snippets here because I think it's inspiration. It was inspirational to me when I read it 20 years ago, but I think it could be inspirational to us now. So Guillermo O'Donnell, many of you have heard of him, very famous scholar of Latin American politics, who grew up in Argentina during the 1950s, was nearly arrested when the student group in which he participated ran afoul of the dictatorship of Juan Perón. Later, during the military dictatorships that ruled Argentina in the 1970s, O'Donnell was a target of threats from armed groups on the right and left of the political spectrum. He sees a direct link between these terrifying experiences and his work as a social scientist. I've done research on questions that originated in the fact that we were governed by horrible regimes in Latin America, and because I much preferred democracy. Adam Przeworski, who was raised in communist Poland in the 1940s and 50s, recalls that one's everyday life was permeated with international macro-political events. Everything was political. And they go on and on about, scholars that I think we all really admire, like James Scott and Theda Skocpol, moving as activists during the civil rights movement, and thinking about the Vietnam War and all of the things that they did as kind of sitting in that space between scholars and practitioners. And I think that we actually are moving into that space now, and it is incumbent on us as a community to think about how we want to be in this new space. I am not used to that personally, right? So I feel like I am trying to find my feet in that, but I think we all should try. I think we all should try. So thank you, Thania, for being that kind of scholar for us. And I hope we can all try together as a community to make things better, to move towards that normative good of peace.
Thank you so much, Professor. And then I will pass the floor to Professor Thania to respond, if possible, to all those comments in 5 minutes.
Yeah, it's given me a challenging task. Thank you a lot. I'm really inspired. So I think it's about what you all said it's about what we study, it's about how we study and how we influence change. Ezra said the constructive change. I was thinking about Lou as well. So what we study, and I think all of you mentioned the different areas, the focus, but I think it comes from the need. If we start from what's this piece that, and I think Marie-Joëlle, you talked about that we rightly kind of lost in the diversity of peace, that what is that peace we want in a realistic way? And then what is the gap? What do we need to study in order to fill it, to get there? I think that's for me the driving question, and has always been that famous civil society project that Roberto quoted, where he, by the way, called me the general. So I'm happy that he's not completely scared about the whole thing. So that started because I was seeing in the field what was going on with civil societies, with so much different things. And then I was reading what we were producing, and then I was seeing what practice we're doing. And I thought, like, that's not getting together. We need to know more. And we had also, remember, a practitioner group accompanied the project, where they were asking questions and saying, like, well, no, if you want to be relevant, you better also look at this, you better look at that. And that was quite tense at times, but it was very, very formative for our research. So what do we study and how do we study? That's the thing, like, how do we study? And I really liked also this example. What is it that we can do jointly? We have large projects like Horizon, but we still all work, like Marie-Joëlle and others said, in bubbles. Yeah, we can have our work packages and don't talk to each other. And that's what large projects do. And this is a shame, because we need to create projects where we are forced to collaborate. And we have to agree, and not just to disagree for the sake of the fashionable talk of one. I have the argument against this one because that one. Yeah. So no, it's about what do we agree we want to change, and how do we do it from very different perspectives. And also, and I liked what Ezra said on the biases. That was really strong to say we have these biases, and they're very often Western created. It's very different if you look at the world from Africa, for example, where people think like, yeah, fine, finally, these people in the West have the same problems like we. They live in fragile societies with uncertainty. Welcome to the club. Very different perspective. So then the other one is like, when we say, how do we study that we do it differently, is really this, I would say, it's difficult when you're a PhD student to talk about a collective research, but still to see what's the collectiveness in it, where are your peers that are doing similar things, and all these kind of exchanges that help us drive and see what are we part of the bigger thing, that my research contributes to this bigger thing. And what Christine also said, the critical lens to it, and not just the lens like I need to find out this because that flies in a better publication. I always said to younger students, yes, you should publish in high-ranking journals. Of course you should, but you need to have a reason. And the reason goes beyond I have to publish. You want to share something, and you want to use that opportunity to structure your thinking systematically. And then, but publishing alone, as we know, is not enough. So how do we influence? And I think I like that what all of you said. What are the, and Christine and also Marie-Joëlle, Ezra, Roberto, what are those spaces? And it's not the usual where we just discuss, let's be clear. If you know the systems of reality, if we present research and you have a couple of people from even ministries and the ones you might want to influence there, who are they? They are the people who work in the research department who have absolutely no influence on the practitioners in their own departments. Yeah. So, but you have the illusion that you're talking to the practitioners. So if we don't include them and don't have this interaction, it's not enough to have a big research project. We also need to jointly feel the need. The people we want to influence need to be part of that. And then the last point I want to make is this knowledge production and the normative frameworks. I'm writing on a piece of rethinking inclusion at the moment. And I agree with all of you, we have so much knowledge. And how do we go into these spaces and influence? Yes, we can write op-eds, some of us do it, but how would we change if we would collectively do things? Yeah, that would be so much better. But it needs to be contextualized. We need to say, this knowledge, what we have, speaks to this particular thing, this particular policy, this particular event. Otherwise it doesn't work. That's how practice functions. And it's totally okay, as I said, that not everybody knows that, but everybody has the production of knowledge and we can use it. I want to say this just briefly, this example on inclusion. So we know a lot about inclusion and that inclusive processes work. And what practitioners did with that knowledge is taking bits and pieces out of it and then saying, I mean, the research I've done on inclusion has been so often wrongly quoted because they just make simple correlations because it worked. We gave up at a certain stage to write emails that this was wrongly quoted. But the point is that if you take an advocacy strategy, use some snippets of the research, and then say, for example, today, I hear that very often, civil society and women need to be included, completely ignoring that not even the conflict parties themselves are included. Yeah. So what are we talking about? And also framing inclusion solely as representation and not thinking about how you can influence deal making and what is it about the influence. It's not about how many people are sitting at the table. It is about what are the needs of people on the ground and how their needs can be included, can be on the agendas of those peace talks. And that is possible. But it's not possible with a loud advocacy strategy on saying, where are they? Because then every practitioner says, like, are you ignorant to the reality around you? So also, how do we channel knowledge to advocacy organizations, help them rethink? So we need a lot of different spaces where we help with the knowledge we have. The last point I want to make is the politicization. In doing that, it is so hard because of the politicization. If you say A, you're automatically in that bubble of the so-and-sos. If you say B, oh, you are one of those. So if we would come up with a declaration, this is the knowledge of peace research, we want to counteract this militarization, which is crazy, yeah? We would be all put in some sort of bubble and dismissed. So we need also resistance strategy and very clever strategies on how do we resist the politicization of this, because I've seen that, and the danger is, I remember like 30 years ago, yeah, we're really getting old. When I started in peace research, there was a differentiation. You worked either in a peace research institute or in a security research institute. And that was your basically political home. So, and we parted from that. That has stopped. And I think we're gonna go back to it. That's what I see. And I think that's the danger. We should not let that happen. So we need this conversation with the security researchers as well, because they will inform the discourse. So we need to shape the discourse before and not run after it. I stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor Thania. Fascinating, and well, give us a lot of to talk. I wish I could have an hour for each one of you, because the questions will definitely lead us to this. But I will like to Sunyan to present some of the questions we have and open the floor to the public discussion. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Camila. Actually, over the past an hour, we have a number of very fascinating questions that have been raised. Some questions are quite topical, some are more foundational, and some are more related to contemporary issues, some are more related to system and the like. It all can show that we are all coming from different direction, but with burning questions at the moment. So let's try to address some of them. To the speakers, I have posted those questions and requested to cover one or two. Now I can see where we are at the moment in terms of timing. So we have roughly 18 minutes left, which means that I know I'm giving a very hard time. Each of you will need to spend about 3.5 minutes each. And let's see how things go. Let me just start by, inviting Roberto. Roberto, here the question is, so when we say the success in peace studies, are we talking about the success in peace studies as a discipline? Or is it really about making progress in peace? Does development in peace studies really generate peace, more peaceful society? Would be your response, Roberto?
Yeah, well, my mic, okay, it's on. Well, thank you for the question. Well, the point I was trying to suggest a few minutes ago is actually the following, that unfortunately, I have to say, there is not much correlation between the growth and success of peace studies and the actual impact in. So that's a source of my observation starts from acknowledging this gap and the difficulty with the very objective difficulty to find ways to fill that gap and have a positive impact. And I share with you my own, perhaps too skeptical view that neither academia nor the policy world are very promising avenues to fill that gap at this point. For the reasons that I briefly mentioned. So it seems to me that in the effort to promote peace, what we have done, or what the policy world has done in general, is to add new layers of innovations. So peacemaking, peace building, state building, stabilization, peace tech, and so on and so forth, all been designed to work within the system. And this has prevented deeper change. So we add a new layer, we face a problem, we have more inclusion, more women, more this or more that, or longer time, etc., without questioning a system which is structurally violent, with a state-centered system which is perpetuating itself. And in the name of state security, we continue seeing widespread violence, the death of civilians, and so on and so forth. So obviously change is very difficult. Obviously change requires time, but I wonder whether we have been looking in the wrong direction, but perhaps we should look more towards civil society, social movements, and those kind of knowledge that comes out of people living in conditions of rupture.
Thank you, Roberto. And actually, the next question is about American foreign policy. This particular person really finds that the current American foreign policy is, imperialist, and then particularly concerns that if that, influence may target Latin America, especially Brazil. What's your thought? That's a question. Can I invite Christine just to make some comment on it?
I wouldn't say that I'm an American foreign policy expert, but I think we all have some thoughts about what Donald Trump thinks. I will say from my perspective as a dual citizen of both Canada and the UK, and especially as Canada, that I'm definitely feeling some of the threat in the North American, in the broadly North American and South American sphere, and it's very acute. What that looks like in terms of greater energy and strategic self-sufficiency. It's, well, America's already self-sufficient when it comes to oil. And that has been the case actually for quite a long time. And it was done very strategically with fracking and very, very deliberately. But I do think that you have to think about how Donald Trump thinks about the world when it comes to US foreign policy, in that and the era that he grew up, right? This goes back to thinking about the book that I was just mentioning earlier, that we are all influenced and shaped by the events of our lives and our own personal experiences. And for him, he grew up in a period where oil was a huge, important strategic point of leverage. And I think that has really affected how he thinks about the world, that even though America is actually self-sufficient when it comes to petroleum, and he knows this, but he sees this as a way of leveraging against other countries. And I'm pure speculation, but part of what I think he is trying to do is to squeeze China through oil, right? So if he is able to get at Venezuela and those supplies, if he is able to control what is coming out of the Middle East, and specifically with Iran, with that 13% of China's exports on the oil side, then, you add that up and up a bit, and it looks like it turns into something quite significant. And Donald Trump was nothing more than leverage over his adversaries. So that's the way. I mean, there's an imperialist narrative to it. I think there is a legacy narrative to it. So this goes back to what Marie-Joëlle was saying about emotions, right? That we really underplay the role of emotions. And for people who are in the second term of their presidency, they're often thinking about, well, what do I leave behind? How can I be remembered? And I think that's always been the case with Donald Trump. He's thought about remaking that map, but it's because he wants to be remembered. And so, these are ways that are maybe like don't make it into a lot of the ways in which we study things, but I think really should, right? That personalities matter. And they shouldn't be discounted, as a lot of quantitative political scientists tend to do, as an error term. This is not an error term, right? This is actually something that really drives what is going on, even though it is sui generis and we can't always capture it. It is deeply, deeply important. And we are seeing this play out right now.
Thank you, Christine. Again, want to say add a lot of comments on this, but I'm conscious of time, so let's move on. Ezra, we have another very important question about ongoing issue. The question is, how do you see the rise of the global far right in the study and practice of peace building?
Well, maybe I can take this question together with several other questions that asked about whether peace research is only for global south, right? And Christine's point that maybe global north should be the subject of peace research too. So I think we need to be thinking about. In the past couple of decades, especially after the Cold War. The Cold War ended, our focus has been mostly on civil wars. But I think today, yes, violent conflict is still there, it's on the rise, etc. But equally important is political polarization, right? And we see it in almost every country. And even though maybe it's not a civil war yet in some places, it's still very destructive, and it is still it's a type of conflict, intrastate conflict, that we need to be really thinking more about. And there are other literatures and disciplines that work on this. I have a political psychology background, for example. That's how I came to the study of conflict. There are a lot of people who are working on political polarization, how to sort of reduce political polarization, etc., thinking about different interventions. But it seems like our field is not also in conversation with those people either. And maybe we need to do that better. So that's something that I can say, that maybe it's also about expanding our toolbox, not and also maybe thinking about the existing tools that we have, like dialogue, mediation, etc., and how they can be applied in these kinds of contexts, not just civil wars or violent civil conflicts. I also maybe think about, in relation to this Madhav Joshi's question about why he thinks the resistance to peace research or peace knowledge is more relevant to Western countries. This is what he suggests. I would say not just Western countries, but I would say the resistance comes from mostly countries that are sort of ruled increasingly by populist regimes or populist leaders, democratic backsliding, and increasing authoritarian tendencies. These kinds of societies increasingly seeing that they don't need bureaucracies that are specialized in this kind of knowledge. I used to work at U.S. Institute of Peace, and now, it is closed. And U.S. Institute of Peace, actually, back after the George Floyd protests, several of our colleagues wanted to engage with what was happening in the U.S. And they told them that no, you only have the mandate to work on external conflicts. You cannot work on any conflict within the US. And then they were very frustrated because they thought what we do here in this institute, we can help our country, but we cannot do it, right? So you're right. There is a lot of resistance to that. Like, we don't need it. It's some type of mental barrier, some of it. But I think it's also that not only Western countries, we also see that resistance and pushback in any country with this kind of more domestic political transformation going on.
Right, right. Thank you so much, Ezra. And Mary Joelle, can I just actually invite your wisdom on tricky question of us, researchers affiliated to any institutes? Because sometimes, we really know what we need to do in order to collect the right data and engage in communities. But sometimes the ethics community within the university or journals have a peculiar kind of standard to abide by. And we know that if we just follow this rule, we can't really do the right thing that we believe. How do you deal with this kind of challenges?
Thank you for the easy ones on you. No, this is an important question. It is an important question for a number of reasons, but I think, it has become even more important in light of the comments that Christine made about ethics nowadays, right? There are a number of reasons why our universities, journals, ethics boards have developed a set of rules and approaches to how we engage in the field. And in many ways, while sometimes misguided, in great part because many of them are actually imported without much adaptation from the hard sciences, they are necessary because as researchers, especially researchers based in the global north, right? When we go to the field, we come back, but we leave our interlocutors, we leave the communities we work with behind, and therefore what we do and do not do, the way in which we do it, actually has a real clear security, sometimes life and death impact on the people that we engage with. So I want to start by saying that the rules are important. Now, they are constraining in part because they are modeled on something that is not adapted to social science work, but also because, and I think that's extremely important, our universities, our research structures, our communities are risk. I'm sorry, the word is escaping, but we don't like risk. And therefore, the idea is to minimize risk, not necessarily for us as researchers, but it's the blowback on the universities, on the research funds and what have you that really matters. So, given the closing of spaces that everyone has talked about, given what Thania said about the importance of real collaboration, not just, work packages, simultaneous work packages, I think that there is a discussion to be had with those who actually design and legislate around ethics. And a discussion like that has already happened. For those who might not be in the know, for example, there was a huge discussion at the American Political Science Association a couple years ago on what it means to be transparent and accountable in qualitative research. And it started from the wrong place, but it ended up being extremely important and useful for us in actually deepening what it means to be ethical. But being ethical, I think, also needs to be rethought, because ethics is not just about, security and whatever. It's also more broadly nowadays about our engagement beyond the final point. Often you do research, you publish your paper, and that's it. But in a world in which there are deep and very worrisome changes, I think that there is a necessity to actually engage more deeply with ethics on the long term. Something akin a bit to what development scholars do when they work with communities and actually try and really be collaborative in the way in which not only do they produce research, but also they in the way in which they actually use research beyond the actual, publishable products. So I do think that there's a lot that we can do more on this, and maybe an engagement of the community with the journals, sustained systematic engagement with the journals would help us navigate the challenges that I think we are going to be faced with, given the way in which the world is now changing.
Thank you, Marie-Jo. So finally, I would like to invite Thania back. Guys, I can see that we're gonna definitely running out of time, but can I just ask just a couple more minutes to be, to be flexible with that? Thania, you have multiple questions, that you may need to address, but can I suggest that include at least one question from my perspective? It's about the future. There is a question that when we see the youths who feel disempowered, who feel pessimistic about the future, how do we encourage them? How do we deal with them? And also, if we know some educators who are dealing with, engaging with youth, what would be the advice that you can give?
Yeah, I wanted to actually take that question because it reminded me I was giving a talk, a masterclass, let's call it at a conflict resolution university. And a lot of the scholars that were there, the students asked, like, what's the whole point nowadays to study conflict resolution? Because we're not going to get any jobs here. So I said, listen, I think you got something really wrong, because striving for peace is an attitude with a lot of methodologies attached to it, but it's not a job necessarily. Some of people were just lucky that it became an industry and that they got jobs in that industry, but that's not what it is about. When we talked about social movements, we talked about change. Is it in your heart to be a change maker? Find out whether it's in your heart to be a change maker. And if you're a change maker, you have to go for it. And that you can do way better, I tell you from experience, anywhere besides in a peacebuilding organization. So you can do it everywhere. So the knowledge you get is not wasted, whatever you do in your life. I think that's how you see it. The second one is that I think it is very important to encourage people, to inspire people, to say, like, to highlight these cases. I worked during the war in Nepal, advising sort of on the peace process, and like how many 20 years later there is suddenly a Gen Z movement, and a Gen Z rapper anti-corruption is the new president. How cool is this? It's possible. So this is the things we need to tell people. Yes, it's a mess, but we can also tell people from historical research we know it is always going forwards and backwards, and there's different phases. So you, young people, you are the future, because you will see the backslash, but you also see this one, and you can be part of this, and you have social media at your hands. You can be influencers of everything you want to achieve, because we are retarded in this, but you guys and girls, you are cool. So I think that's what we need to do. And what I also think we need to do more, we have to have YouTube channels, cool animations, things where we can say it's possible. It's possible. And I think these are things what educators need to learn. We need to inspire people and tell them the world is full of possibilities, even if it's a mess at certain times in certain spaces. And when you are in the mess, it's very hard to look out of it. But that's why you need people like you who study, young people who can tell people it's possible. And that's my message.
Thank you, Thania. I think, as much as your message, your attitude, your tone really just inspires people as well. Thank you so much, Thania. Camila, back to you.
Well, I would love to add more comments, but we have run out of time. So just thank you and say how it was an honor to listen to each one of you. And then with Thania, thank you so much, because speaking from the South, we are leaving this space a bit more optimistic for how the field can evolve. and how it can be transformed from inside and outside, speaking from the outsider way, right? So from the outsider point of view, I would also welcome you to join us in dialogue, in these spaces of dialogue that can be created, can be transformed if you use them well, right? Because resistance doesn't need to be violence, as we have so much exposure outside. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Thania. Thank you, our panelists. Thank you, the audience that stayed with us until this point. And of course, thank you, the staff of ISA who helped to make this possible, this space possible. Thank you so much, Joel, Hannah, Sarah, and Kat that couldn't be here, but thank you all. And I will hope to see you soon in another space like this.